Throughout the country, we're seeing more and more high school students being criminalized for minor offenses, misbehaviors in class, disrupting the classroom. All of a sudden, we're seeing more and more high school students not only going to courtrooms and facing adult-like trials, but also getting locked away in jails for months, sometimes up to a year. Now, this is a very serious problem that we're seeing in the country. It's known as the criminalization of student discipline. And here to talk to us a little bit about this issue is Ilona Minkowski from RT's The Ilona Show. Ilona, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the school-to-prison pipeline, which is something that we've seen in the country over the past couple decades. Can you tell me a little bit about what the school-to-prison pipeline is?
Sure, you know, and there's a lot of evidence to this, too. A lot of studies have been done, a lot of timelines have been made, and basically a lot of people will route this back to the 1980s, where we heard a lot of the tough-on-crime rhetoric during the Reagan era, and that continued, of course, into the early 90s, when also there were a spate of violent incidents at schools or shooting incidents in schools. And so then people started to freak out, right? This was an emotional reaction. And so by 1997, I think something like 79% of schools ended up having these zero-tolerance policies towards alcohol, towards drugs, towards any kind of violence. But what we've seen slowly is that this has started to drift into other areas. It's not just being tough on violence or alcohol or drugs. It's being tough on kids who want to doodle, or a kindergartner who might throw a temper tantrum. And it's really just becoming obscene, if you ask me, and so much evidence there is pointing that this is really detrimental, that a lot of these kids end up then dropping out of school, or they're less likely to go to college, and that once you are in this system, much like for adults being within the prison system of the United States, once you've gone to court or once you've been arrested as a student, then the chances are that you're probably going to end up there again.
Just to give the audience an example of how stupid and minor and petty these so-called offenses are, I want to read you something that Alternet reported on. They gave a few examples of some cases where students served actual time in jail for things that they did in class, including doodling, which is something you mentioned. A 12-year-old in Louisiana who suffered from hyperactive disorder was suspended for 2 days after warning kids in lunchtime, "I'm going to get you if they ate all the potatoes." The child was charged by police with making terroristic threats and then was jailed for 2 weeks while waiting a trial. Another case was in 2007 when a 13-year-old by the name of Chelsea Frazier wrote "OK" on her desk. So police arrested her along with 4 other middle school students. They were handcuffed and paraded in front of their classmates before taken to a police station house where they were shackled to a pole and interrogated for hours. So we're seeing students being treated like criminals. And then we have criminals in the United States, people in Wall Street who get away with, you know, basically ripping off the American people. Why is it that we're focusing on these young high school kids that aren't really doing anything wrong? These are the type of misbehaviors that you and I were probably guilty of when we were in grade school.
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and I really can't understand myself, because here what you're doing is you're criminalizing being a kid. And it's not just high school, right? It's in middle school that we're seeing this happen. It's in elementary schools, in kindergarten. It's throwing a tantrum as a 5-year-old. I would say that that's pretty normal. I would say that most kids probably had that happen at some point. Or I think there was also an incident where a boyfriend and girlfriend broke up in middle school, and so they poured milk on each other, and both of them received tickets. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? You're supposed to be in the school system when you're a kid so you can get an education, and you send your kids to school so that they can stay out of trouble. And then if you need to, you have school counselors, you have the school principal, you have people that will foster this type of growth. But instead, you know, I think what we've seen is a reaction to some of these zero-tolerance policies. In some cases, maybe the teachers themselves realize that they're a little ridiculous, but because the zero-tolerance policy says absolutely no weapons in school, then if a kid brings in a Lego that has a little plastic gun toy, they feel like they're obligated to report it. You also see a big presence of police officers on campus now. They're campus police. And so there I think that it becomes up to the discretion of these officers. Maybe some of them are a little bit overzealous when it comes to ticketing. And then, of course, you start having to question the motives of the prosecutors and of the judges. And, of course, the Cash for Kids judge, who was just sentenced to 28 years behind bars, I think that's become one of the most famous cases and one of the scariest cases, because here's a man who put thousands of kids away, put thousands of kids behind bars because, A, it did good things for his reputation to seem tough on crime, and that allowed the community to want him to stay in that position. And at the same time, he was accepting bribes from his cronies who run some of the private prisons to put more kids in those prisons. I mean, it's disgusting, if you ask me, what's happening. And you should not be treating children this way. What you're doing is you're creating an entire, a group of people since childbirth, but since they're very young within the school system who are constantly scared because they're constantly treated like criminals. And that whole scared straight attitude isn't making them better, isn't making them perfect human beings. Quite the opposite. They usually end up doing more things like this, and I'm not going to call it a crime or committing some kind of offense because I don't think doodling on your desk should count that way.
I love that you mentioned the private prisons because I think that that is really the #1 problem in our justice system right now, not only with grade school kids, but also with the general population. You see more and more people getting locked up for nonviolent offenses, especially drug-related offenses, because these private prisons are making a massive profit. And keep in mind, private prisons in the United States became tremendously successful in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, that's when we started seeing more and more of these zero-tolerance policies implemented within our schools and our school districts. So another question that I wanted to ask you, Alona, is that, you know, these tickets that are being given to grade school kids are different from citations that adults get. Now, can you tell me a little bit about the difference between them?
I'm not totally versed on the exact difference between them, but often I know, if you get one of these tickets, then that might end up leading to some kind of a suspension from school, or they pile up on your record. Obviously, it's a little different than whether you're getting a criminal citation and having to show up in court. And, of course, there's a bit of a legal gray area right now for a lot of these kids because they're wondering if this might affect the way that they can start applying for colleges. And so, of course, in some cases, you can argue to have your entire record wiped clean once you turn 18. In other cases, once the judge thinks that you've served your time or done your community service or taken enough time off of school, then maybe they'll wipe that off too. But it's becoming, an increasing problem depending on whether you're actually getting these criminal citations or whether you're getting school tickets. The kids are having to deal with this. And the tickets in particular, too, often what we see is they come with fines involved. And for a lot of parents, they're saying, my kids just got a $400 fine for doing something at school. I have a lot of other kids to raise. This isn't the time to start making me pay for, what really are disciplinary actions that could be handled, once again, like I said, by the school counselor, by the principal, or leave it to the parents at home.
You're absolutely right about that. And another thing that I'd like to add to it is that, with regular citations that adults get, they can just pay the fine and be done with it, right? But in this case, not only does it affect the grade school students' admissions into college later on in the future, they also have to appear in court. They can't just pay a fine and be done with it. So, we're treating we're being harsher on these students than we are with adults, which is ridiculous. Finally, there is a racial aspect to this that is being reported from several different news sources. It turns out that in Dallas, Texas, 30% of the student population there are black. However, 62% of the students who get these tickets are black. Alona, do you feel that this is another way to discriminate and basically unfairly target minority groups?
Well, unfortunately, I think that argument often can be made, and I'm not just saying that because I think that there may be racism involved, but because there are actual statistics to prove this, like you just mentioned. I mean, Texas basically just opened up their books, and I think this was one of the largest studies conducted there, where they were really looking at these effects. You were right, and that 30% of the population is black, and yet 62% of those who get these citations are actually black. And I think that, it also has a lot to do with perhaps certain communities that this might be happening in, and it has a lot to do with the fact that maybe these kids don't have as good of a structure at home, right? Maybe they don't have maybe they have a single family home, and so when they come to school and they get one of these tickets and then they're disciplined, they don't have a parent that's going to tell them maybe you shouldn't do it again, that's going to have a normal conversation with you, and so then once again they start falling into this system. And like I already mentioned, the same survey from Texas also said that after your first suspension, you're 3 times more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system after that. And that's the exact same thing, as I mentioned before, that we see with our regular prison system. So if it's the adult prison system where you end up creating an entire second class of citizens because after this they're disenfranchised, after this they can't get a job, now you're just starting it at a younger age. And unfortunately, who it's going to have a negative effect on most, if the statistics are what they are, and which they prove, is going to be probably minority kids. And it's really, it's ludicrous. It's a complete overreaction, an emotional overreaction that this all started with. But now what's happening is it's ruining lives, and it's costing a lot of money to put kids in jail rather than to, grow young people, teach young people that might end up helping this country in the future, helping further its progress through jobs, through innovation, whatever you want to call it.
Absolutely. Our public education system is supposed to do whatever it takes to prepare these students for the future, not criminalize them. Alona, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.